concerning print in 1588. It survives at the back of an Arabic edition of Euclid's Elements that was published by the Medici Oriental Press in Rome. The firman asserted the rights of 2 European merchants to their trade of valuable printed books and pamphlets in Arabic within the empire. It ordered that the traders were to henceforth be left unbothered or unmolested by those who are opening up their shipments by force and with little or no payment at all, are taking their wares and interfering with trade. Here's what the decree actually says. Be it hereby known to all governors, sea captains, judges, and other officials stationed in the imperial domain, the 2 European merchants by the names of Anton and Horatio Bondini, being bearers of imperial permission to conduct trade, are buying and selling and doing business by importing certain goods and valuable printed books and pamphlets in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Some persons are opening up their shipments by force, and with little or no payment at all, are taking their wares and interfering with their trade. It is therefore directed that the said merchants and their agents and employees be allowed to carry on their business in safety, and that their merchandise be not seized, and that whosoever disobeys this decree of mine be reported immediately. It is also ordered that their books and goods be purchased in return for the payment of the correct price. There should be no longer any complaints in this matter. This is written in Constantinople in that year. If we jump forward a few centuries to the reign of Ahmed III in the early 1700s, he also writes a firman about Ibrahim Mutafarrikh and his printing press. Now, I'm not going to read this whole statement. It's very, very long. He starts off talking about the importance of education and learning for the elucidation of minds. And we'll get into the meat of it now about the Sultan allowing the printing press during the time of Ibrahim Mutafarrikh and why he allows it. He writes, among the technical processes, printing is like coining money and impressing paper with a signet ring. Books produced by printing cause several thousand volumes to be produced from a single volume, all of which are accurate copies. With little effort, there is great return, making this a desirable activity to pursue. By virtue of your having composed a learned tract about, and having expertise in, the various above-mentioned activities, and he's talking about Ibrahim Mutafarrikh and his abilities as a printer, you will see to the necessities and expenditures without loss of time, so that on a fortunate day this Western technique will be unveiled like a bride, and will not again be hidden. It will be a reason for Muslims to say prayers for you and praise to you to the end of time. Accepting books of religious law, Quranic exegesis, the traditions of the Prophet, and theology, you ask the Padishah's permission in the aforementioned tract to print dictionaries, history books, medical books, astronomy and geography books, travel logs, and books about logic. So the printing of religious books are not allowed, and they don't really come about until the 1800s. That's when the Ottoman Empire is feeling pressure from other Muslim empires and figures, well, if these holy books are going to be printed, then we might as well be the ones to do it. Anyway, I don't want to get off track, so I'm going to jump back to the Sultan's statement again. The imperial permission becomes proper on account of this well-explained authoritative declaration, this perfectly eloquent and noble opinion. Copies will be printed of dictionaries and books about logic, astronomy, and similar subjects, so that the printed books will be free from printing mistakes. The wise, respected, and meritorious religious scholar, specializing in law, and then he mentions a bunch of scholars here, and he mentions scholars that will oversee the proofreading. With the actual setting up of the press, the above-mentioned books in history, astronomy, geography, logic, and so forth, after they pass the review of the learned scholars, shall be numerous. However, you will take special care to see that the copies remain free from error and depend on the noble learned men for this. So, what do we make of all this? We don't have copies of the firmans of Bayazit from 1493 and Selim from 1515 that were claimed to outlaw any sort of printing. We don't have any proof that these exist. We just have the opinion of this Franciscan scholar that they did exist, and we don't have any evidence that they exist. We have a statement from Thevet in 1584 that such a ban was brought in, but he might not be reliable. And we have these later statements in the late 1500s that foreign merchants can sell printed books. And we have a statement by Marsigli in the 1680s that no legal ban existed on printing books, but there were so many copyists around that there wasn't much of an interest in them. And we have a firman by Ahmed in 1727 that says printing is allowed and it's good for society. So as far as we can tell, there's not a problem with printing, but there just wasn't a social need for it. This comes back to the social construction of technology I was talking about earlier. Society didn't deem it as useful as it did in the West because the West didn't have this huge industry of calligraphers and copyists, and there wasn't the same religious prohibition on books in Europe as there was in the Middle East because there wasn't the same tradition of calligraphy attached to the Bible as there was to the Quran in the Middle East. Now, in the early years of printing in Europe and the Ottoman Empire, if you wanted to buy a book, for the most part, if you were going to buy a book, it was going to be a holy book. If you were a Christian in Europe, you would probably buy a Bible before you would buy anything else. Even if you wouldn't read it yourself, you would want to show it off to others to show your wealth. If you were a pious Muslim and owned a book, one of the earliest would be a glorious handwritten copy of the Quran. This would be an item that you would prize. You would show it off to others if you were wealthy. And if you were authentically religiously pious, that would be another reason to purchase it as well. But if you could only really afford a few books, and in Europe it was the Bible, this could spur on the nascent printing industry. But in the Middle East, if it was the Quran, this wouldn't spur on the printing industry. You would be purchasing books on logic and astronomy. That wouldn't be the first book that someone would own. That would be, I don't know, the 5th or the 10th book that someone would own. So the economic stimulus to the printing industry didn't really come to the Ottoman Empire until much later. Now let's jump ahead and look at when the printing industry actually does take off and when the social conditions change that allow for this industry to spring forward. Things change in the Ottoman Empire, and not just the Ottoman Empire, but for Muslim intellectuals across the world, in India, Russia, Egypt, and other places in the 1800s. This is where you have what some scholars call a republic of letters. It's this print sphere where people are reading each other and writing to each other. They're reading each other's newspapers. They're commenting on it. And it's this connection with people that crosses borders. And this spreads across the world in the 1800s in the Muslim world. The explosion of this print culture happens from about the 1860s onward. The center of Ottoman publishing activity is in Istanbul, which is the location of the majority of Turkish-language printing presses. It happened following the inauguration of the 1839 Tanzimat reforms. The Tanzimat was a period of reform in the Ottoman Empire from 1839 to 1876. With this, there was a far-reaching need for book production, which came about in response to the growing number of primary and secondary schools in the empire. Many private printing presses opened during this time, and the print culture continues to expand in the end of the 19th century, with a flourishing of printing presses not just in Turkish, but also in Arabic, Persian, Greek, French, English, Armeno-Turkish, which is the Turkish language but written with Armenian letters, and books in Karamanlı, which is newspapers and books in the Turkish language, but with Greek characters. But ironically, one of the things that spurred on the advancement of printing in the Ottoman Empire was the arrival and presence of foreign Protestant missionaries who came to the Ottoman Empire to try to convert people to Christianity, specifically Protestant Christianity. And they weren't just doing this among Muslims, they were doing this actually mostly among Catholic and Orthodox Christians that lived in the Ottoman Empire who were from Armenian background or Greek background or Syrian background. But anyway, when they came, they set up print shops and they had an enormous influence on the Ottoman Empire. By the early 19th century, foreign missionaries established a publishing infrastructure in the Ottoman Empire that produced thousands of books a year in multiple languages. One group, the American Board, which were a Congregationalist missionary organization, set up printing operations in Malta in 1822, and this Mediterranean island was chosen as the center of their print operations for the Middle East missions to Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Greece, and Turkey. The Malta operation consisted of 3 presses with font types in English, Italian, Greek, Armenian, and Arabic. One of their first books was a copy of the New Testament in 1831 in Armeno-Turkish. The same year, 78,000 copies of 14 works, totaling 5 million pages, were printed in modern Greek. So the total print output in Malta from 1822 to 1833 was 350,000 volumes. Part of the reason that missionaries were able to do so much is because print technology allowed it to become easier to transport printing presses from Europe to the Middle East. Lord Stanhope's development of a freestanding and portable iron hand press in 1800 enabled printing units to be set in one portable piece, and they didn't have to be disassembled and reassembled upon arrival to its destination, which enabled faster technological spread of printing. And the Muslim development of printing came from the successes of portable presses, as they didn't have to be joined to a larger industrial infrastructure. So Egypt and Istanbul didn't have to catch up to Europe in order to produce a productive print sphere. So with the spread of printing presses, with the need for more of them with government reforms, they spread to Ottoman provinces. Turkish printing presses were established in Ottoman provinces in Anatolia. They typically produced the Province Gazette, the official newspaper, and they also produced Ottoman government yearbooks, which government officials used to spread official state news to the provinces. Publishers also used these government presses to print private books. So you have official imperial print offices being established in the 1860s and 1870s to produce religious texts, public documents, border protocols, international agreements, directories, dictionaries, educational textbooks, and works by Ottoman literary figures. And with the spread of newspapers and books, this changes the way that literary figures write. They're using a simplified style of Turkish in their newspaper articles in order to make their writings accessible to non-scholars. In earlier generations, the writing would be very dense, very purple prosy, because only those who would be wealthy and highly educated would have access to written materials. So this vibrant reading culture had major influence due to its social criticism, instruction, editorials, and reporting of foreign news. Rising rates of literacy in the 1890s, brought about by government educational efforts, expanded the reading landscape outside of elite circles. There's a transformation of society and the formation of an educated middle class that really asserts itself with the formation of the independent Turkish Republic in the 1920s. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. So this vibrant public sphere made the modernization and nationalization efforts of the Turkish Republic possible by increasing both literacy rates and access to books. So all that to say, the whole issue of printing presses that I was dealing with at the top of this episode, why did they show up in Europe so early but don't show up in the Ottoman Empire until much later, I think has to do with this issue of the social construction of technology. So human action shapes technology. A society determines if a technology is useful, and the Ottoman Empire simply didn't deem a printing press useful, like much of Europe did, until much later when there was a much bigger need for books and the industry and the number of people who were involved in calligraphy couldn't keep up with demand. But for centuries they could, so that's why you don't see as many printing presses. Anyway, I hope this episode was enjoyable, and I'd like to thank Firas for asking me the question. All right, well, that is the show for today. Thank you so much for listening. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, and especially our spy masters, Baron Fraser, Carl from Norway, Chris from Maine, Moondoggy from Ohio, Vic and Irene, and Rick Knowlton, and I'll explain what that means in a second. If you like the show, please leave a rating and review on the podcast listener of your choice, whether it's iTunes, whether it's Stitcher, Google Podcasts, whatever. Also, we have a Facebook page. You can join us there to keep up the discussion on latest episodes. And finally, if you really want to dig in deeper with this show, I encourage you to join the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were an elite reconnaissance and espionage detachment of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the History Unplugged membership program. Learn how to join by going to patreon.com/unplugged. So here's what you get if you become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you join at the level of Scout, you can get early access to new podcast episodes, along with enjoying absolutely every single episode of the History Unplugged podcast ad-free. All 270 and counting episodes. If you join at the level of Intelligence Officer, you can also get access to premium episodes, like a multi-part series on the life of Audie Murphy, the most decorated combat soldier in World War II, or the 10-part series Ottoman Lives, a series that looks at the cast of characters that made up the Ottoman Empire, such as the Sultan, the Eunuch, the harem servant girl, and the soldier. And finally, if you join at the level of Spy Master, you get all the same stuff as the Scouts and Intelligence Officers, You also get a shout out to you and or your business at the end of each episode, a 3-pack of hardcover history books, plus you'll be put at the very front of the line